Greetings, I'm Yvonne Stapp Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Today, we're going to learn about disinformation, some important examples, how it is created, why people fall for it, and how to combat it. Our guest is Elliott Negin, a senior writer for Union of Concerned Scientists. Mr. Negin has a long and distinguished career in science and issues journalism, and his work has appeared in many prominent publications, including The Atlantic, Scientific American, Alternet, EcoWatch. He's held numerous positions at other prominent organizations such as the Natural Resources Defense Council and National Public Radio. We're very pleased to have the opportunity to tap Elliott Negin's expertise on the issue of disinformation. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Welcome, Mr. Negin, and thank you very much for joining us. To begin, I'd like to get clear for people what disinformation is. This term came up a great deal in the last administration, and now it's still out. But we know about misinformation. Can you tell us what disinformation is?
Sure, and thanks for having me on the show. Disinformation is simply purposely misleading the public on particular facts. So, everyone knows what misinformation is. That's when it's inadvertent and not done on purpose. Disinformation is purposefully, if you want to use the term, lying about the facts to advance an agenda.
Okay, and we have been targeted a lot with this in the last 5 years or so anyway, but it is getting very difficult to contend with. I had contacted you specifically for one that you had written about. A good bit was on a nuclear reactor people are reacting to this. And the disinformation is pretty concerning. And then another one that I'll ask you about is the fossil fuel industry. But could you tell us about this natrium fast breeder reactor? What was the issue in that is such a piece of disinformation?
Sure, well, the backstory is that the nuclear industry in the United States is at an impasse. There haven't been any, except for two nuclear reactors being built right now. The industry has not been growing at all. In fact, the number of reactors has dropped over the last 10 years. There are roughly 93, 94 reactors operating today, but up until about 10 years ago, there hadn't been one licensed since 1978. 1979, your viewers might remember, if they were old enough, that was when 3 Mile Island happened, which helped undermine the future of the industry. In any case, all the reactors that are operating today are called light water reactors. They use regular water from a nearby water body to cool the reactor. Except for two that are being built right now in Georgia, which will cost twice what they were estimated to cost and are running way over schedule. They probably won't go online until maybe next year, when they were expected to go online 5 years ago. There are no standard size nuclear reactors being built today, except for those two.
Now,
but you asked me about the natrium.
Yes.
There is a push on the part of the industry to come up with new designs, which are actually not new. They're based on unproven concepts from more than 50 years ago. They're called advanced reactors, but that's really a misnomer. But unlike conventional light water reactors, they rely on sodium or molten salt or gas for cooling. And their proponents claim that they'll be less expensive, safer, and more secure than the light water reactors that are operating today. The natrium is a prototype. It's not even a prototype yet. It's really it's still being designed and built. It's the company that's building this reactor is called TerraPower, and it was founded by Bill Gates.
Yes.
And Bill Gates wrote a book about a year or so ago called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And he went on 60 Minutes last year and promoted this reactor. My organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, issued a report looking at the Natrium and other reactors that have been called advanced to see what their promise is. And according to our report, despite what Gates said on TV, which really oversold what this reactor could do, we found that this reactor, which is a sodium-cooled fast reactor, would likely not use any less uranium as the reactors that are in use today, would not reduce the amount of waste that would require long-term isolation. And the waste is really the Achilles heel of the industry. I mean, we don't know what to do with the waste, which will be dangerously radioactive for hundreds of years. And there could be other safety issues associated with the Natrium reactor that obviously he didn't talk about. The other problem is one of timing. It'll take 10 to 20 years, perhaps as long as 20 years, to get these reactors that are still in prototype stage to a point where they'll be commercially available. And we don't have the time to wait around, given the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just put a report yesterday. We don't have the time to wait around for these reactors. So we have to go with what we've got today. And fortunately, we have renewables that off-the-shelf renewables that by 2050, 80% of our electricity could be coming from them, according to US Department of Energy. So we don't need to spend a lot of money on these unproven technologies that are, as far as we're concerned, a little bit pie in the sky right now, and would not be available in time to really do anything about climate change.
Right. Now, the disinformation part of that is that somebody like Bill Gates can have access to major media to put out a message to basically advertise a technology that has not worked. This particular system has never worked, I think, but the other is the expense and everything else. And I want to emphasize your point there that the renewables are available, they're easily deployed, they are certainly much less dangerous, and they are much less expensive than all of this. And so thank you for that, but we try to clue the public of how to understand that it is disinformation here. A number of scientists, by the way, have really come out on this thing, on the Natrium project. Another one that is gathering a lot of response recently is the fossil fuel industry's just general climate change disinformation. Could you give us a general idea of what they are saying, the general point there, and then we'll like to talk about the Koch brothers and so on.
What has pushed this issue to the forefront of the last few months is the House Oversight and Reform Committee has launched an investigation of the fossil fuel industry's longtime climate disinformation campaign. And at the end of last October, the committee invited 4 top executives from the oil industry companies, from BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Shell, who testified under oath to the committee and denied that they were funding such a campaign, which is, they denied it under oath. But in any case, but they did acknowledge that climate change is an existential threat, but they also downplayed the role that the oil industry plays. They said that fossil fuels contribute to climate change. They don't just contribute to climate change. They're the main cause of climate change.
Right.
So it was, I wrote an article dissecting their comments, which was it's on our website that I published late last year. In any case, going back to your initial question, this disinformation campaign has its roots decades ago. And it originally got started when a coalition of 50 corporations and trade organizations launched in 1989 the Global Climate Coalition, which was just a year before the United Nations created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it downplayed the threat posed by climate change. Over a period of roughly a decade, it was always identified by the news media, and it was understood that this was an industry-funded group. It was clear. But by the end of that decade, some of those key members of that coalition, including ExxonMobil and some other oil companies, some automakers, decided to start enlisting the help of think tanks and advocacy groups that have been what I call laundering disinformation for the tobacco industry, fighting government controls on secondhand smoke and things like that. And the two biggest funders that came out from the late 1990s, like 1998 or so, the two biggest funders of that campaign, that PR campaign, were the Koch brothers. Well, it's now just Charles. David died 2 years ago, or 2019 he died. But in any case, the Koch brothers spent, over the last 20 years or so, spent $162 million to fund roughly as many as 90 groups to manufacture doubt about climate science and attack renewables and attack government action on climate. The second biggest funder has been ExxonMobil, which has spent more than $39 million on roughly 70 groups, many of the same groups the Koch brothers have been funding, to spread disinformation about the reality and seriousness of climate change and the viability of climate solutions such as renewables. One thing that I've been very interested in is how the press, the mainstream press, handles this issue. And in 2013, I wrote a 6-part series for the Huffington Post, where I looked at how news organizations over a 2-year period covered climate and energy issues, and how they identified or failed to identify more than a half dozen think tanks and advocacy groups that were getting funded by Koch and ExxonMobil. And if you just discounted the Americans for Prosperity, which was largely known as a Koch-funded and founded organization, if you took them out of the equation, only a quarter of the time did journalists ever mention that these think tanks had any connection to the fossil fuel industry. And they would present them in a way that gave them the status of bona fide sources by quoting them and giving them equal footing with climate scientists. Journalists wound up presenting a false equivalency between these spokespeople from places like the Manhattan Institute or the Competitive Enterprise Institute or the American Enterprise Institute and bona fide climate scientists as he said, she said presentations, and basically confuse the public, because they would be saying, oh, climate models don't work, and these people who are talking about climate change are climate alarmists, and they just want government control over everything, and there's nothing to worry about.
Right.
So that's been a problem for 2 decades, where the
Yes.
press has given a platform to fossil fuel industry funded spokespeople, not identifying them as essentially functioning as PR agents for the industry, and giving them credibility.
Right. I understand that there is that they regular media has not been up to the job of taking this kind of thing on and has let this continue. Can we get an idea of the major sources of disinformation? So you've pointed out the climate industry, and we'll get these individuals in there too. The Koch brothers are certainly a major one. They know how to fund certain other things, programs and things like that. They can really impose a great deal of power. Can you give us some other examples of where we should look for disinformation? So the fossil fuel industry, absolutely. Nuclear industry, absolutely. Anything else?
Sure, but let me step back for a second, and because this will be helpful to your audience. My organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, published what we call a disinformation playbook a couple of years ago, and you can find it on our website.
Thank you.
And we identified, our website is www.
I'll put it on the screen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. In any case, the disinformation playbook identifies 5 main strategies, which most of these campaigns use. The first one is to fund counterfeit science and then pass it off as legitimate. The second one is harass bona fide scientists. 3 would be to manufacture uncertainty about science. 4, buy credibility by funding academics, scientists, academic centers, and think tanks. And lastly, manipulate government officials and procedures, largely through campaign contributions and also outside spending on elections.
Yes.
So those are the major things, strategies that are being used. As far as other industries that are involved in this kind of work, besides the nuclear industry and the fossil fuel industry, I mean, big agriculture.
Yes.
For example, in August 2020, a report came out by this organization called the U.S. Right to Know that revealed that Coca-Cola had been paying scientists to downplay the link between sugar and obesity. That got a lot of attention. That was in the newspapers. And then the other example that I've written about and others have written about is how companies such as Monsanto, which is now owned by Bayer, have spent 30 years of research and 25 years marketing these genetically engineered crops.
Yes.
But they have not dramatically increased food production or reduced pesticide use.
Right.
They don't perform as advertised. And what happens is with Monsanto is they force farmers to pay for these seeds every year. They get a control over the market that way.
Patents. Yeah.
So in any case, those are 2 examples. Agriculture is another example where this kinds of disinformation campaigns go on.
Yes, thank you, because I wanted to make sure the audience would understand that there are several areas where there is a real concentration of disinformation, as you pointed out, that they can control academics, people doing the research, they can control people in Congress through contributions, and so on. So it's a really vicious thing. Thank you also for pointing out that the Union of Concerned Scientists has information out there, and we'll make sure that we post that on this program and in the event page. The other thing is there is a problem of government, I should say, complicity in giving into this. Some people have pointed out because of the lobbying is so effective and contributions to people in Congress, but there is a complicity. Can you explain this? And also, is it an international problem? Is it beyond us?
Well, one thing you said earlier that I would hesitate to say that they control members of Congress, but I will say that. Okay, well, let's look at it.
Influence.
Well, the influence, and part of it has to do with a lot of the folks who in Congress who are working hand in glove with the fossil fuel industry represent states where the fossil fuel industry is a primary economic driver. So there's a reason why James Inhofe, who's retiring shortly from Oklahoma, he's famously brought a snowball onto the floor of the Senate and said, well, if there's snow out there, there can't be any climate change. I mean, he gets a lot of money
Yes.
from the fossil fuel industry, but
Yes.
Oklahoma is a petrostate.
Yes.
Members of Congress from Texas tend to like oil. So,
Yes.
so some of it has to do with the fact that their constituents are oil companies. So it's partly to protect their constituents or protect the people who are giving them a lot of campaign contributions. So in any case, the government complicity, there was a really interesting case that I wrote about a couple of years ago where we were talking about James Inhofe, and Inhofe was speaking during a hearing, and he was saying that he was congratulating or promoting the comments made by an individual from a nonprofit organization who was talking about a report that made false claims about climate. And without boring you with the details, essentially what I was able to uncover in the story was there was a connection between all these aspects of this conversation that went on during this hearing and ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil gives money to Inhofe. ExxonMobil helped fund the report that was cited, that Inhofe cited, and ExxonMobil funded the organization that had its spokesperson testifying in front of Congress. So there's this echo chamber. The report that was being discussed was funded by ExxonMobil. The spokesperson testifying in front of Congress, his organization was funded by ExxonMobil, and Inhofe was funded by ExxonMobil.
Yes.
And then these reports often would get reported on by the news industry, and they would quote the spokesperson from the think tank being funded by ExxonMobil, giving that think tank representative credibility.
That's right.
So this is how this vicious circle works, and this echo chamber works.
Right.
And anyway, going back to your original question, there's a lot of money being exchanged is being doled out to members of Congress. There are still probably 140 or so members of Congress who have been identified as climate science deniers.
Right.
They're all Republicans, by the way.
Yes.
In any case, I'll give you an example that I've written about. Over the last decade, there have been maybe a half dozen non-binding resolutions or amendments voted on in the House and Senate that were related to a carbon tax. And now keep in mind that ExxonMobil since 2009 has claimed that it supports a carbon tax. In any case, the last one that happened in the House happened in 2018. There was a non-binding carbon tax resolution that stated a carbon tax would be detrimental to the United States economy, which means that if you vote for it, you're against a carbon tax. So the House voted 229 to 180 in favor of the resolution, which means that 229 members of the House voted against a carbon tax. Now, nearly 70% of the House members who voted for that resolution collectively received more than $1.28 million in campaign contributions from Koch Industries, PAC, and employees during the 2018 election cycle. Now, ExxonMobil also played a role. 75% of the folks in the House who voted for that against the carbon tax, essentially, 75% received ExxonMobil donations in the 2018 election cycle. So on the one hand, ExxonMobil says we support a carbon tax. On the other hand, they continue to reward folks on Capitol Hill who are against the carbon tax by funding their campaigns. And members of Congress who have introduced carbon tax legislation over the last decade have been ignored by ExxonMobil. They don't hear from ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil says one thing, but then behind the scenes it does another. Now, Charles Koch has never been in favor of carbon tax. He still denies that climate change poses a major threat. So he's in a whole
Yes.
different.
Right, and it is a problem. I want to find out now in terms of disseminating this disinformation. Social media has played a very important role, apparently. Tell us a little bit about that. Why isn't there control over this flat-out lying sometimes?
Well, there's been plenty of stories in recent, months and years about how Facebook and other major social media operations are failing to police what's on their sites. So it's not just on climate that there's a problem. There's a
No,
problem
it's
across the board.
disinformation. Right, exactly.
And unfortunately, the general public's not discerning enough about where it gets its information. In any case, in the case of climate change and renewables and climate solutions, there's a nonprofit group called Influence Map. And in 2020, it reviewed 25,000 Facebook ads that were placed by the oil and gas industry. And it found that the oil and gas industry in the year 2020 spent nearly $10 million just on Facebook ads. More than half of that was spent by ExxonMobil. Now, these ads claim that natural gas is a solution for climate change, for example, and that cutting carbon emissions would make energy too expensive, trying to scare
this is
the
true.
general public about the necessary transition we have to make to renewables. So scaring people that it's going to cost them, a lot of money to be able to do this. We can't afford it. And natural gas, which is methane, is not a solution for climate change.
Right,
We have to curtail our use of it dramatically. But these are ads that were placed on Facebook, and that's just Facebook. They're placing
Right,
ads
it's-
elsewhere.
Right,
That's just one-
exactly. Yeah, it's just such a big problem that social media has less control, and most of the owners of social media are not exactly progressive people. And they're making a great deal of money out of this. Now, you pointed out that the public is not discerning enough, but I want to underscore that for many people, how are they supposed to know when something is a flat-out lie? This can be very persuasive information. So tell us, where can they find reliable information? What should we do to inform the public?
I think that the general public has to pay attention to the source of the information. So they're legacy news organizations that have been around for a long, long time that, everyone, journalists make mistakes on occasion, and every time you pick up a newspaper, you'll find corrections. But there are legacy news organizations such as the New York Times, Washington Post. Those are two great examples.
Guardian.
Case where you can by and large, trust the information you're getting from them. Now, one other thing I mentioned earlier, I did this study of the 8 new mainstream news organizations, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, back in 2013. By and large, these organizations have stopped quoting a number of these folks who were outright lying about the seriousness and reality of climate change. But they still quote folks who falsely denigrate renewables. these news organizations still run columnists such as George Will, who
Yeah.
has a terrible track record on what he says about climate. But in any case, they're still largely, infinitely better than some fly-by-night news organization that you never heard of. One other thing I should mention is that about a year or so ago, I did a study, though it's unpublished, of how Breitbart, Daily Caller, FoxNews.com, and a few other right-wing websites, news sites, cover climate. And those folks have not stopped quoting climate deniers.
Right.
And those, and a lot of people get their primary information from
Right.
those websites. And those websites are publishing lies about climate and renewables.
Okay, then what can we do? We have just a few minutes left to try to tackle this problem. So first of all, the public needs to avoid known resources that flat out lie, like Fox News, for example. But how can people educate themselves, get better information? Very little is written in the regular newspaper about some of the hydrogen energy and some of, the natrium reactor and a lot of other things. So there is a limitation. So tell us, how can the public improve its understanding of what is disinformation?
Well, one thing you can do, and I'll toot our own horn, you can go to my
Of
organization's
course.
website. We have a climate accountability section in our website, and what we're trying to do is expose corporate disinformation, and we're working to pressure fossil fuel companies to align their business models with climate realities and demand that they pay their fair share of costs on climate damages and adaptation. So organizations like United Union of Concerned Scientists is one place to go.
Right.
There's a really great website called Inside Climate News,
Yes.
which a couple years ago was one of the news organizations that revealed that ExxonMobil knew for 50 years
Eons.
that its products were harmful. That's an excellent source for
Yes.
bona fide good information. And like I said, legacy news organizations that have been around for a long time are by and large trustworthy.
Okay.
Despite my criticisms of the fact that they've historically given a platform to climate science deniers.
Right. So that's very good. So now we know there are some sources out there to direct people to. Then the other one is, even if you know these things very well, like you do, or those of us who sort of keep up and are familiar with these sources, what can we do? Because people might say, well, it's up to you in the public to do something about this, but we're not sure what it is we can do to change this situation. We can't control these organizations that are wrecking the globe with their energy sources.
Well, my organization's been doing a series of webinars on disinformation, and it's open to the general public.
Yes.
And if your viewers you can contact me directly, and maybe we can post my email address, and I can get you information about how you can find out more about these webinars we're doing on disinformation.
Right, and these kinds of things have gone on forever. Trying to improve that information, giving people a sort of voice, but people cannot had the power to reverse this situation. So today, for instance, we have a very high rate of anxiety, eco-anxiety it's called, with young people because they feel powerless to do anything about this. So that is my question. Do you have any advice about how the public can then change this situation? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, well, I think one thing you can do is you can work locally by, first of all, everyone should vote, and climate should be a litmus test for any candidate running for office at local, state, and federal levels. Besides that, you can get involved with your local city council, your county board, whatever, to push on getting your local authorities to do more to mitigate and to work on mitigating climate change, as well as we're going to have to adapt to it because there's a certain amount of carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere that's going to be there for a while. So, but we can
Yes.
hopefully avoid the worst possibilities by moving as expeditiously as possible to cut carbon emissions. Right now, I'm involved with a campaign locally here in Washington, D.C., a coalition of 24 organizations to try to get our bus authority to electrify its bus fleet much more quickly than it's planning, because we
Yes.
want to get rid of the fossil fuel buses. So there are things that, if there's a local Sierra Club in your city, join the Sierra Club. Help fund environmental groups. Pressure your local politicians as well as your federal, your House member and your senators. Contact them. We have to put pressure on the. We have the technology we need to do the job. We just need the polish. We need the policy. We need the policymakers to move, and we have to pressure them as much as possible to get them to move on this.
Thank you ever so much for that. And I will say, just add to this, we have to end now, but I want to reinforce your point there that the Union of Concerned Scientists is a first-rate organization for this information in general, and their webinars that help to engage people and provide quality information. And Mr. Negin, you have been a major source of this very good information. I hope you will keep it up. I remember suggesting very strongly that you write a book. So I hope you will keep writing. I will make sure that we've got your blog up on the screen for people should tune into that. You write on a number of topics of great interest. I thank you very much for giving us all this wonderful information today, and I wish you the very best.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.